Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and over the weekend in Sunday's papers, you doubtless saw this. After big raids, heroin demand spikes, and so it was actually very fortuitous that already before I saw this headline, I had arranged to have tonight's guest. Tyler Williams is the president of the UConn chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And we're going to talk about this and how we can figure out what's wrong with our current drug policies and how it can be made better. So welcome, Tyler.
Thanks for having me.
I guess maybe we can start out, you can tell us a little bit about how you became involved in SSDP.
Yeah, absolutely. So my story is pretty typical in a lot of our circles with SSDP. I'll be honest, I grew up in Oxford, Connecticut. I grew up as just kind of like a kid going through a small town high school. I used marijuana pretty frequently towards the end of my high school career, did fine in school, got accepted into UConn, and it was a big part of my lifestyle at that point. And a lot of my friends, when we were going, we were trying to figure out, what would we do on campus besides class? And one of my friends had heard about this group. She was like, "Oh, it's like the drug group, and like we should go and meet these people." And I had already developed ideas of like, I think like weed should be legal because I like weed and it doesn't seem to be hurting me. So I went to the first meeting, and my friend actually didn't end up coming with me, which was kind of interesting. But so I went to the first meeting alone, freshman. This is the second or third week of school, and I get in there, and the first thing that happens is, the president at the time poses a question to the group and says, "Why should we legalize heroin?" And I get in there, I'm like, "Well, did you guys not want to smoke weed?" I was like, "Is that not what we're here for?" And I learned really quickly that was not at all what we were there for. So that was the first time I'd ever been exposed to the phrase harm reduction, talking about really making sure that people who choose to use drugs like heroin or any drug really that has associated risks with it, that those associated risks are mitigated to the full extent that we possibly can. So my first introduction with Students for Sensible Drug Policy is a crash course in harm reduction, a crash course in heroin policy, and that's really interesting. I like to describe my path through Students for Sensible Drug Policy is one of those romantic comedies where the two like protagonists get together under dubious circumstances, and it might be a bet or a trick or whatever. So I come to SSDP because I want to smoke weed, and that's
Right.
kind of dubious.
And that is sort of what people on the outside would think.
That's what they think, and it's true for a lot of people. But once you get into it, you develop the genuine relationship like those romantic comedies. And the genuine relationship, as I realized after a while, is that drug prohibition doesn't work. It hurts people, and it hurts people of color and our minority populations disproportionately across this country. And I realized that drug policy reform, is not about the drugs; it's about the people. And when you declare a war on drugs, you're not getting guns out and shooting at plants, and you're not shooting at packets of powder. You're shooting at real people, and you're incarcerating real people. And that's a problem. So that's kind of my full, and now I'm here, I'm a senior, it's been 3.5 years. It's been a really interesting experience. And I gotta say, I should mention too, is like Students for Sensible Drug Policy has been easily the most characteristic experience and the most iconic experience of my college career. For 2.5 years, I was a computer science engineering major. Last year, I stepped up my involvement. I became the treasurer for the group, and halfway through the year last year, as a junior, I decided that engineering wasn't what I wanted to do. Policy work was where I wanted to be, so I switched my major to history. I cranked out a few extra courses. I'm on my way to still graduate in 4 years, but totally, I had the job offer locked in at an engineering firm, and I just did a complete, kind of reversal because of this amazing group and this amazing movement that's really like kind of taken over my life.
So SSDP is not just at UConn, it's an international and national level organization. So can you tell us a little bit about the organization?
Sure, yeah. So the quick description of SSDP is that it's an international network of grassroots activists that are dedicated to ending the war on drugs. And basically, Students for Sensible Drug Policy realizes that drugs are a problem in our society. They can be harmful. But they also realize that prohibition has failed ultimately and will not be the way that we solve our drug problem. And so instead, Students for Sensible Drug Policy across the world pushes for harm reduction in lieu of prohibition measures. So the structure is, it's kind of this loose network. There's a professional staff in Washington, D.C. right now. It's about 8 or so people. And they kind of oversee the management of the nonprofit. They oversee outreach and the materials and the resources. And then there's individual chapters at individual schools. We're a student-based organization. And there's a lot of autonomy at the chapter level, which I think is great because we're in, I think, 48 states right now. And so each state has its own nuanced and different drug policies. And so
we're seeing that more and more, that states are each setting their own policies.
Yeah, and that's becoming, for a while there, it was very uniform. I think my understanding of drug policy in the past 30 years is they had kind of taken a lot of directives from a federal level, and now states are starting to go off on their own and trying their own ideas. So it's really useful to have chapters in individual schools, individual states, working on their own policies. So yeah, UConn is just one chapter of many. The last count is somewhere close to 300. It might be over that. I know we're definitely over 3,000 students as a network. And yeah, that's kind of a nutshell of the structure.
Now, things are happening in Connecticut now in terms of cannabis policy. Recently, medical marijuana, a very stringent medical marijuana bill was passed, and some recreational bills are being considered in addition to industrial hemp bills. So can you give us a little bit of an idea of what's happening at the state level in more detail than what I did?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So I think the kind of big and fun headline right now is the recreational cannabis. There's 2 bills. They've been introduced by Representatives Candelaria and Representative Vargas. And so Candelaria is the state representative for New Haven. Representative Vargas is the state representative for Hartford. Both bills have been referred to the Judiciary Committee the last time that I checked, which was a few hours ago. And basically they're infant bills. They're about a sentence or 2 long. And both bills basically clearly state the state will legalize marijuana possession and usage for adults 21 years or older, and will set up a regulatory system to regulate the production, sale, and possession of marijuana. There's a couple wording differences in each, but that's the gist of it. So, I think it's interesting because the media hasn't gotten into this frenzy yet, which I kind of thought they might.
It's probably coming.
It's coming. I think the Hartford Courant just finally did their article on the 2 of them. I know I was recently interviewed by the Yale Daily News, so Yale's picked up on it. Our campus media's picked up on it, and that's about all that I've seen so far. So I think that's the big thing right now. And really, what we're doing is we're waiting for it to do anything in the judiciary. That's right now it's kind of just sitting there. Then, like you mentioned, appropriately, there's an industrial hemp bill. So last year, the state legislature passed a public act that commissioned a report from the Department of Consumer Protection and 2 other departments about the ramifications of legalizing industrial hemp in Connecticut. The report was favorable. Basically, the concluding paragraphs. It's like a 10-page report. Yeah, anyone can access it. It's very easy to read, honestly. And the conclusion was that there would be modest economic benefits for Connecticut if they were to legalize and regulate industrial hemp, and they didn't foresee much federal interference there. So now there's a bill to do that, and the bill basically lines up with the study and says, we'd like to legalize industrial hemp. It'll help out with our economy a little bit, and the idea is to line it up with. There's some language in the Agriculture Act from Congress, from the federal Congress, that allows states to run pilot programs of industrial hemp as sort of like trial runs, which is kind of cool. And so there's a bill in consideration. I think it's in the General Law Committee right now. It hasn't been scheduled for any hearings that I know of yet. And that would do that. So those are kind of our legislative things going on. There's also, and so this goes to something that happened a few years ago. So in 2012, Connecticut passed a medical marijuana law. Students for Sensible Drug Policy played what I think was a pretty big role in that, or we were there as supporters. I was a freshman at the time, so I don't really know if I got the scope right. It felt like we were doing something big, but I'm sure lots of folks really worked so hard on that bill. There's like countless people that poured a lot of energy into that, but we were there, and it was cool to be a part of that experience. Unfortunately, the community of patients, or people that could be patients, the community of advocates, and a lot of the industry feel that the law has been very restrictive, and that the industry is having a difficult time. Patients are having a difficult time. The access for patients is not of the highest quality. The amount of patients we have is not as high as it could be, or as it should be. And so right now there is legislation that would, the legislation that's in the House or in the General Assembly would, as far as I know, legalize it for pediatric use for children, because we know a lot of children can benefit from certain cannabis products. And then there's also a few efforts right now. Connecticut for Safe Access, they're the Connecticut chapter of Americans for Safe Access. We're working closely with them to expand the list of qualifying conditions for patients for medical marijuana in Connecticut. Right now the list is 11 or 13. They just added 2 like last week. We're trying to add 4. Which we think will expand the patient base, expand access to people who need it, and really kind of also help keep the industry afloat and high quality. Because without a high quality industry, we're leaving our patients in the dust.
And I wonder if these initiatives will help research as well, because research has been quite hampered, and we don't know exactly what all the potential medical benefits are.
Right, yeah, and that's a big part of this. I know Connecticut, one of the interesting things with how they did their medical marijuana law is the idea was that some of the folks in Hartford felt that some of the other medical states were too loose. They weren't being cautious enough. They wanted to make Connecticut into this beacon of. We wanted to set a national standard for how you run a high quality, high caliber sort of program, and research was a big part of that. So they're trying to make this a very regulated and well understood field, which is very I think admirable. However, I think that what happened is in trying to do that, it's become too burdensome for a nascent industry, for people in Connecticut too. I mean, patients just honestly can't afford the program right now. If you look at, it's interesting, if you look at the prices in a lot of the dispensaries that have recently opened. So for one, it took 2 years for dispensaries to open. Right. So that's a big problem in the first place. The prices in the dispensaries are almost twice as high as what you can get on the black market. And that's not to mention the fees for registering as a medical marijuana patient. That's not to mention the difficulty finding a doctor who will recommend you medical marijuana, because that needs to happen first in Connecticut. So a lot of times, people who would otherwise be patients and be, part of this industry and consumers of that industry, if
they're still buying on the street.
They're still self-medicating and buying on the street, and nothing's really changed this medicalized program, which sounded amazing. And personally, I'm a big fan of both, legalizing and regulating a recreational kind of sphere, and then having on the other side a medicalized sphere, because there's, I think, a lot of folks who can benefit from a well-understood medicalized, professional idea of cannabis and its benefits.
Right.
But it's not happening because no one can move. No one's got the leeway or the ability to do anything to produce the medicine well, to sell it at reasonable prices, or to access it in a reasonable way.
And I guess, unlike some more purified drugs, the street product is not quite as much at risk of being tainted as some other street drugs.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to put on the record that almost all myths of laced or tainted cannabis are blown out of proportion. They are a negligible percent of the amount of product available on the street, because it's very difficult. So for one, most of the drugs that you could possibly lace cannabis with are more expensive by weight than cannabis is, so you'd be taking a net loss. And then for two, most people who are using cannabis can tell what's in their bag, because it's a plant and it's different than a powder.
Right.
White powder is white powder, and that's hard without chemical reagents. But if you got a green plant that's doused in white powder or it smells off, it's pretty easy to tell what's going on, and so the danger there is lower. So people who are looking to medicate, there's less of a risk there than getting off-brand benzodiazepines.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the federal classification of cannabis. Can you talk about it and how it impacts what happens at the state level?
Yeah, absolutely. So the scheduling of cannabis is, it's really absurd. I actually did, so I run a radio show at the university, and our second show last semester, we talked about the absurdity of the scheduling system. So they schedule cannabis as a Schedule I drug, which the qualifications are that they have a high potential for abuse, a high potential for addiction, and no known medical values. I think there might be one or two other criteria, but those are the three big ones. So all three of those are pretty patently false by most of the research that we have. And so I guess, but the big thing here is that when it's on Schedule I, there's no way for anyone to do research. You can't get government approval to research the plant. No one can access it for any usage. And so on a federal level, medical marijuana programs are very technically illegal.
And of course, you can't find a medical use if you can't study.
Correct. Yeah. If you've got no one doing those studies legally, you don't have a large body of research behind it. But I actually just read about how there have been more empirical studies done on marijuana and its medical uses, because you can petition the government to allow you to research, and in fact a lot of groups have, and they do petition the government to let them do the research, but you have to go through lawsuits, and it's much harder than just doing any old study on any other chemical. So it's still very prohibitive. But there have been more studies on the medicinal value of cannabis than there have been on many FDA approved drugs that are out in the market today. Just much higher volume. And I'm talking, there are some drugs, and I don't know the specific examples, that have 1 or 2 clinical trials, whereas medical marijuana has hundreds.
And probably going way back from before Prohibition.
Before Prohibition, yeah. There's, I think the first recorded instance of like a study of the medicinal value is from the 19th century, I want to say. There was some documentation of its healthful effects. Not that it's necessarily the most valid or relevant research there, but it is. You're right. There's a long-standing tradition.
See, there's some graphic that you can see on the internet, something an old-timey cough syrup, and it has things like morphine.
Morphine and heroin and cocaine. Cocaine cough drops are toothache drops as local anesthetics, and that's the thing, is like cocaine is a Schedule II drug, and in some instances you can be prescribed cocaine as a sort of anesthetic. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think those cases are rare, but legally you can. Whereas federally speaking, you can't for cannabis. And your question was what happens on the state level.
Yeah.
There's been good progress on that, thanks to a lot of the advocacy on the federal level, especially Americans for Safe Access, and a lot of court cases across the states where recently the federal budget was just cut for any DEA activity on medical marijuana. So they have
and this is a very recent development.
This is the past couple of weeks. My understanding of it is that that the DEA still has the jurisdiction to enforce this, but they have no money to do it. So in the past, what they've been doing is they usually target. They've usually been trying to target places that they say don't meet the standards for the state. So they'll look at the state medical marijuana regulations, they'll find a couple like pet violations, and then they'll go raid the facility. And they've got jurisdiction over that because they're the federal authorities. As of now, with this new budget and the new decisions, I'm reasonably certain that they just don't have money to do that. So they can go in, but they're gonna eat the cost. The federal budget doesn't allow for that. Also, we've been relatively lucky with some of the attorney general's decisions to, kind of deprioritize, and the president as well, to deprioritize that sort of enforcement. Again, they generally tend to be more symbolic than have a real tangible effect on the ground. But for the most part, when Connecticut passes medical marijuana law, and even in this last study about industrial hemp, they were saying how at this point for the federal government, it's a total loss for them to enforce those laws against medical marijuana patients, because the public opinion is, it goes both ways with legalizing recreationally, but I think a majority of the states have some sort of medical program. I I don't think they have the resources or the public will to enforce those sorts of things anymore. But they still are, which is really unfortunate. And I think it shows one of the difficulties with kind of the stubbornness of the drug policies that we have is that in the face of such adversity and like common sense, they're still kind of going at it.
And I know that one of the problems I've heard is that the vendors who are selling legally, banks won't take their money.
Yeah, so that's an issue, particularly in Colorado, where there's a very, I would say, robust recreational program, a very robust recreational economy, is because the banks are federally regulated. They can't touch that money. And that's tough because now you have security risks when you've got a cash-only business that's dealing in. I mean, I think there was something like $40.9 million between like May and October of 2014, something like that. It was a lot of money, and all that's in cash, and it's hard to secure that. And that's a really big problem too. There's progress being made there, and I don't know the specifics of it, but I do know it's looking hopeful. And I think now that we have 4 states that have voted to do the same, plus the District of Columbia, I think the need for for a better federal handling of that sort of money is going to push Congress or someone on the federal level to do something, even if it's a stopgap measure for the next couple of years. Yeah.
So, what's the story of Colorado a year or so later?
Story's looking really good. So, as I said, we have these 2 bills in the Connecticut General Assembly, and I'm actually, tomorrow I'm meeting with some of the representatives, a few of my representatives, a few others who have agreed to meet with me and talk it over, and of course the introducing representatives to go and thank them for their championing of the issue. And so I've been doing my homework, because I don't go into the State House unprepared. I never go in without at least a couple of days of research first, so I'm getting all my facts straight. And there's a lot of really good comprehensive reports. So the Drug Policy Alliance has put together a briefing on a year after the program. The Marijuana Policy Project has done the same. So I'll give you some of the bullet points. So first off is the economic benefits. It's the easiest to talk about because I think it's difficult to dispute. Colorado taxpayers are getting money back because they've made so much money on the tax revenue from cannabis. They have not lost any money. I think the tally was about 16,000 jobs that were directly related to the cannabis industry because you have to get licensed to work in it. So they can track that like that. It's really great tracking for job growth. So 16,000 direct industry growth jobs. But that's not to mention there's a huge boost in tourism. So a lot of job growth around there. Huge boost in people just moving there. A lot of people are moving to Colorado for this because it's very attractive, especially to young people. And so, housing markets, it's getting expensive. The housing is getting expensive, but that, the economy is kind of bustling. There's money coming into the state. So that's the economic benefits, and there's more. They've reinvested a lot of that. As far as, and I think it's really important. The next thing that's very important to talk about is that the usage rates, and particularly youth usage rates have stayed the same or gone down by all studies. So as much as it went down a little bit, and I'm hesitant to ever say because we know correlation doesn't imply causality, but people like to say that it does. So all I can say is that because the youth usage rates did not go up, I don't think that the argument that when you legalize something, youth usage goes up, that's out the window now. That's gone.
And actually, we've seen the same in research from the Netherlands.
And Portugal.
And Portugal as well, where they legalized for adults. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's the mystique that disappears for the young, with young people's use, or I don't know.
It gets harder to access. I mean, if you look at a lot of the studies that have been done in the past 20 years, teens have always said it's much easier to access cannabis than alcohol because alcohol's
the dealers aren't carding you.
Yeah, and the people who are selling cannabis don't have a business to lose. I mean, they do, but they don't have a business license to lose. They're already committing a crime, so there's no disincentive to sell to someone who's under 21. That's a big thing in it as far as access goes. So I think it's really, really important to show that youth usage rates in Colorado have not gone up. In some studies, they're saying they've gone down. At the very least, we can say, like, I think that argument's gone. No one can tell me that argument anymore, and I'm done listening to that.
So we can't keep it illegal to protect the children.
I think that argument's been that argument's been done for 60 years, but I think it's pretty definitively done now. So then we can look at things like violent crime statistics. Violent crime has gone down significantly. Again, I don't want to imply that's because we legalized marijuana. I could talk about how there's a potential that there's better police prioritization, where they can spend more time on other issues. People don't need to resort to violent crime because their primary source is like a black market, unregulated job. But that's all speculation. But what I can tell you is that marijuana legalization did not lead to an increase in violent crime.
And we do have a phone call.
Yeah.
Before I pick up, I want to point out, though, that with alcohol prohibition, crime spiked during that 12 years that alcohol was criminalized.
Absolutely.
We have a call. Thanks for calling.
Hey, Rona, this is Dennis from New London.
Hi, Dennis.
I have a question for either one of you two. If we legalize, we'll start with pot, which it has been legalized, but has any studies been done to see, because my thought is, if you legalize drugs, then the drug dealers, you would figure, would be out of business. But what they're really going to do, I would think, is that whatever the government is charging or the states are charging for their drugs, they're going to undercut them. So it'll make it easier for people to buy it cheaper. You know where I'm going with this?
Yeah, so I'd love to address that.
Please do.
Be my guest.
So there's really two issues here at stake. The first one is you're right, is that a black market persists, and it is persisting in Colorado. But it's dying down, and we've seen the ramifications in Mexico is that the drug cartels are hemorrhaging money right now, and that's very directly related to the legal sale in Colorado. But you're right, there's still a black market, which still comes with its issues. But the majority of people, and there are, I think, some good statistics to back this up, are going to the legal places because there's less risk for them. And I know, I have family in Colorado, and I visited them for Thanksgiving, and I spoke with some people around there, and they were telling me that, if they're gonna buy cannabis, they're gonna go do it legally because they're not gonna get arrested for it. They're willing to pay those taxes because one, they know they're going to good things because they're going back into education, and two, it's easier. It's so much more convenient than meeting with a person who doesn't have regular business hours, who you don't know what their house or place of business is like,
And you don't really know what you're getting.
and you don't really know what you're getting. When you go into these dispensaries, they have a breakdown of all the major chemical ingredients in all their strains. They have the specific breeding information for you. So you are paying a premium for legal cannabis right now, but that premium, it's worth the money. I think most people are agreeing. And as this industry grows, I think that you're going to see a reduction in prices because it's economies of scale. Once this thing goes through a couple more states, once they can start exporting, their growers, I think that kind of the economics is going to kick in and the prices will be driven down. But there's a good argument there to make sure that when you tax these things, you don't tax them so much that no one's going to buy your product. This is the problem with our medical program.
I have another question.
Yeah.
As far as if, let's say you smoke a joint, how long does that stay in your system?
So that question, I think, is a little misleading to a lot of folks. So for the most part, studies show that the intoxicating effects of cannabis are gone within 2 to 4 hours. Depending on depending on the person's physiology and depending on their usage, right? However, when you say stay in the system, there are certain parts of the plant and chemicals that stay in the body. They're stored in fat cells, but these aren't.
What I'm getting at is you take someone that may smoke a joint before they go to work. A lot of places, workplaces, have they don't allow any kind of drugs or alcohol. So if you go to work and you get tested and you smoked a joint 4 hours ago,
you're generally going to come up.
Technically, they could fire you, right?
Correct.
And it's even worse than that.
It's about 30 days as far as like what you can be tested for, and that's through like a typical drug test. However, there are some tests that'll go back 9 or 8 months, and I think that's a big problem right now.
Well, part of the problem, I think, is that drug testing as it's done does not really test intoxication or unfitness to work.
Not at all.
It tests the presence of drugs. And my story is when I worked for Head Start, I had a bus driver who was fantastic, never came to work impaired. But on Monday morning, he had a random drug test. They found cannabis in the system. He was fired.
Right.
The next bus driver I got never used illegal drugs, but he was on some prescription drugs that did impair him. And he got to drive these kids for a long time, even though he was on prednisone and several other drugs that actually did cloud his judgment. So I think testing for fitness to work, we need a little bit better way to do it because it doesn't really protect people the way it should.
I agree with you, Rona. I know people that have been smoking 20, 30, 40 years. They do it on a regular basis. They go to work. They perform their job excellently and has for 20 years. And then that one time they get tested and they get popped, they get fired. And nobody looks at the past records. Well, this guy's been doing his job for 20 years. He's excellent. And yet, so there has to be some kind of reform in testing, I think, if we're going to legalize marijuana.
Yeah, that's a big problem to tackle eventually. I think we're getting around to it. I do know that, to my knowledge from, again, I got family in Colorado, companies are starting to be a little more lax about it depending on who you're working with.
I would imagine it depends on the type of job also.
Yeah, it depends on the type of job, regulations. There's so much that goes into it. It's gonna be an issue we're gonna have to talk about.
Yeah.
All right, one more question. I'll hang up and listen to this one. As far as getting pulled over by a police officer, and I'm sure they're gonna come up with ways of testing if you've been smoking, except the obvious smelling it. What's your thoughts on that? How are they going to handle that situation? I'll hang up and listen. Thank Rona. Thank young man.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so there was a lot of debate around this, and so actually, when the Colorado law passed, there was another law which passed in Washington State. It was Washington, yeah, and Students for Sensible Drug Policy actually did not endorse Washington, and one of the reasons was because of their really restrictive roadside testing policies. And Colorado wasn't much better, but they were a little better. Right now, what they're talking about is nanogram levels. They're looking at 5 nanograms of whatever they're testing for. I think they're testing for THC, in your bloodstream, and so that's a really big problem because we just talked about impairment. 5 nanograms of that substance in your bloodstream could be 2 to 4 weeks out since your last usage, whereas you could be totally fine. And like I said, the effects, the impairing effects, those things are gone 6 hours max. And there was actually just a study done by the federal government that looked at the danger of smoking and driving and found that it is significantly less than drinking and driving. This is not to say it's safe, and it is more dangerous than driving sober, but the effects are more on par with driving angry, driving stressed out, driving distracted. These are all things that we need to tackle as far as like traffic laws go. It's bad. People shouldn't smoke and drive. But we're going to have to look at more... We're going to have to look at more understanding and more like comprehensive ways to deal with people who are driving under the influence of cannabis. And we need to look at it like, what do we do to people who drive and text? Something like that. And again, my personal opinion is that if you're pulled over and you're in a state where the cannabis is legal and an officer smells cannabis on you, I think it's very reasonable that they would do a field sobriety test. And I think it should be a performance-based thing.
So it's related to how impaired you are and
not
percentages of
the percentages of substances, which can vary widely depending on the individual and their types of usage, and really tell you nothing about whether or not that person is putting other lives in danger. Because that's the problem here is we don't want other people to be in danger. And it's when you talk to people who are against legalizing cannabis or any drug, because again, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, I think is very important to note, works on all sorts of drugs and all sorts of drug policy. Our end goal at the end of the day is to keep more people alive and to keep less people in jail. And so when we're talking about driving impaired, that's a big part of it. And we want to make sure there are sensible ways to deter people from engaging in dangerous behavior. But it certainly is not. The answer is certainly not an arbitrary number of nanograms of THC in the blood count. That's just not the answer.
And I noticed that one of the projects of UConn's SSDP is safe rides, right?
Yeah, we do a sober ride program on weekends as much as we can. We're volunteer based, and we do have to charge because people have insurance and gas and maintenance to pay for. But all of our profits, we reinvest in the community, and we do like big campus events and stuff with the money. So it's volunteer based, so we don't get a very regular system, unfortunately. Right now we're working to see if we can get budgeting from the school to pay for insurance and drivers and cars and all that. That's a really important part. UConn used to run their own program. I think it's really important to note that our school had that for a long time. It went away last year, and we've been trying to pick up the slack. It also works as a good fundraiser, and other groups do this too. A lot of individuals do this. This is not just our project, but it's something we stand behind firmly.
Okay, so when you started out, you talked about your first SSDP meeting, and you were sort of flummoxed that they were talking about heroin policy. Right. So I think cannabis is still a little controversial, but not so much. Heroin and some of the harder drugs are a lot more, there's a lot more stigma attached.
Yes.
So what would good heroin policy look like? As we saw in this newspaper article, the state senior assistant state's attorney said, unfortunately, nature abhors a vacuum, so when you remove one group of heroin pushers, another group is going to take its place,
sure.
Which says to me that what we're doing isn't working.
Yeah.
So
I'd like to preface this with some really great research that the UN recently did and came out with, I think last year in 2014, is that they did a global survey of drug use statistics, and they defined what problematic drug use behavior is, and it's basically drug usage that gets in the way of a functional lifestyle for that, whatever region they were looking at. They found that across the world, over 90% of drug usage is non-problematic drug usage, and this spans for all classes of drugs. So before I talk about any sort of specific policies, I really want to put it out there that the majority of drug users, no matter what drug they're choosing to use, are not doing it in a problematic way, as defined by the UN, as defined by kind of our global...
If you're just talking about the drug effects.
If you're talking about the drug effects and how they access their drugs and what they do, there's still problems associated, and I would never want to erase the serious problems of addiction and like families being torn apart by drugs, that is an entire communities dismantled by them. This is not to erase that whatsoever. But it is to say is that when we talk about drugs, we need to be honest with ourselves and realize that the fear around them is unsubstantiated, I think. I think there's evidence to support that. So to talk about heroin specifically. So good heroin policy, to me, is something that looks somewhere in the middle of the Swiss model and kind of the Vancouver model. The Swiss model is one where the government has a project that basically, if you're a person who's addicted to heroin, and you find that you would like to no longer be addicted to heroin, because most people who are struggling with addiction aren't having a great time, you can go to any hospital, and they will give you, they will put you on a program. And it'll be a taper down program. And so they'll start to give you pure, unadulterated heroin. There's nothing that's gonna kill you instantly.
And honestly, a lot of the heroin overdoses are really not from the heroin.
It's not from the heroin.
The other stuff that's in there.
Yeah, or it's an unexpected potency. They'll give you, they'll figure out exactly what's going to be, what's gonna keep you from difficult withdrawal. And then they'll give you that and they'll help you taper down. And then over the course of 6 months, you enroll in this program and they help you find employment. So you have to actually become employed while you're working in this program, or else it's discontinued. The other thing, which is difficult, and I think this would be difficult to fly in America, but they also, they flip it. So if you're very rich and you find yourself addicted to heroin and you need help, you'll be paying for that help. If you're very poor and you find yourself addicted to heroin and need help, you're not gonna have the burden of that help. You're gonna get off heroin at a reasonable cost to you either way.
Well, I think most countries that have universal healthcare systems
that also
have
helps.
An easier time dealing with this problem medically.
Yeah, that's also another really big thing too. Is that it's a public health issue, and when you have more robust systems of public health, I think you've got a better shot at solving drug issues.
So what do they do in Vancouver?
So Vancouver, this might be across Canada. I wish I knew a little bit more about it, but they have safe injection facilities. a little bit different than what Switzerland does. And so instead of providing you with the drug, instead of getting you into program, they give you they have these places where people who are heroin or any intravenous drug user, because there's plenty of intravenous drugs out there, they can go into this building staffed with medical professionals, and they can use their drug of choice. And if there's a medical complication that arises, you've got medical professionals with the tools to come help them and save their life. I think that model might not go far enough to really solve some people's issues with addiction, but it stops people from dying. It gives them a safe place to be, and I don't know the statistics, but I imagine it would cut down on violent crime of people trying to find a place to go to use their drugs. So again, they don't provide the drugs. They don't provide as much of a program. That may have changed over the past few years. I read about this a year or two ago.
Now, Portugal has some interesting approaches too.
Yeah.
That they, I think they have heroin maintenance.
Correct. Yeah, and they've decriminalized all drugs. And what they found after 10 years of that policy was that the addiction rates went down by half, 50% across the board. Addiction and usage rates just gone after fully decriminalizing everything.
Well, I think people should realize that there are a lot of individuals who are dependent on substances for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people who are diabetic are dependent on insulin,
Yeah.
and that a lot being dependent on heroin isn't exactly the same thing. But if you can get a source, clean needles, you're not worried about bloodborne infection.
Yep.
You have a regular source that is pure, that you know the dosage of.
Right.
A lot of the health complications are actually due to our prohibition more than to the drug itself.
And the crime as well. You know, a lot of it comes down to economics. If you're a person who's getting drug tested and you're using drugs that we deem to be unacceptable for you to use, and you lose your job because of that, but you're still addicted to these drugs, you're going to turn to black market ways of getting income. And a lot of that is violent, and if it's not violent, it's still criminal. So a lot of that criminal activity, it's not that the drugs are motivating you to do so. There's plenty of drugs. And even if you look at, we prescribe plenty of children amphetamines in Ritalin and
Sure.
Adderall, but because we've prescribed these, which again is amphetamines, which some people are resorting to crime to pay for their amphetamines. Some
Right.
people have their health care pay for their amphetamines. I think that sentence alone
Sure.
shows you the variation.
And although I'm not really very in favor of putting kids on amphetamines, people who are prescribed amphetamines and under medical supervision do not have the same kind of side effects as meth addicts.
Correct. Yeah, and again, that comes down to the policy is that they've got better support systems to know if their dosage is wrong, to know if it's the wrong fit for them as a solution, et cetera. So yeah, and I would say too is one of the things that I'd like to see the conversation change around drugs is what we define as drugs. I'm a drug user. I haven't used cannabis for months, honestly, because I just don't have the time. But I am a heavy drug user because I drink 6 cups of coffee a day. I use a lot of caffeine. I know plenty of people, being in college, I don't drink that much either, but I know plenty of people who are heavy drug users because they drink 3 or 4 nights a week, and that can be problematic, but we don't talk about them as drug users. And we don't talk about people who are on prescription medications and on their prescription medications as drug users, but they are. And then when we talk about drug users, we don't give them basic human decency, and we forget that they're real people with real lives, and we think the drug consumes them. And I think if you look, there's a lot of communities, especially now online. There's a lot of really interesting support communities of people who are using drugs, not trying to get off of them, and they're going about their daily lives. And you can read these posts on these forums, and it's difficult to verify anything. It's the internet, that's a good disclaimer to have. And you're talking to a lot of folks in this very small community who they've got relationships, they're maintaining steady jobs and places of living, and then they're using this drug. I think a lot of times people see the drug before the person, and they never get past that drug.
And it's sort of arbitrary because in some which drugs are accepted and which aren't in each society.
Yeah.
I had read that, in the 1400s in Spain, you could be put to death for drinking coffee. Now,
Right.
You and I would be in big trouble.
Yeah.
Now, we have only about 5 minutes left.
Sure.
So I wanted to mention a subject that is part of prohibition but not really directly related to drugs, and that's asset forfeiture.
Yeah.
because it's something that I think a lot of people don't know about, and almost everyone hates it.
Yeah. Cool. So, brief explanation of asset forfeiture, and it's glossing over a lot of details for time. If a law enforcement officer, basically they can use any suspicion of drug-related activity to seize property, and that includes cash, that includes assets, whatever it is that a person can own. If the law enforcement officer believes that that is connected to drugs, if they see $10,000, if I've got $10,000 in cash, and the cop says, "Oh, you're 21 years old, why do you have $10,000 in cash?" You might be a drug dealer. They can just take it. And this is before I've been accused of any crime, before I've been charged with anything, gone through a court system. Then I have to prove that that money is legally mine.
So the burden of proof is on you.
Yeah, so your money, your assets are presumed guilty before innocent. That's the breakdown of it. Now, there's recently been some reforms from the Attorney General to kind of try to stop this process. But when it came out, it was this big announcement of asset forfeiture is a thing of the past. The specifics of it look like it's not. It's just changed in nature. There's some caps, et cetera, et cetera. But really, what was happening too is local police forces were using this to fund themselves because they kept a portion. They kept the majority of the money they made on asset forfeiture. They gave a certain percentage to the Department of Justice, and then they kept the rest. So we've incentivized our law enforcement to target people. And again, this goes back to...
Hey, if you have a nice car that they think would be fast.
Yeah, or if they think it's valuable. And particularly, I think this is important because it's racialized. Because it's a lot easier for law enforcement in their institution to believe that, or to not believe, that a person of color could have this much assets. So they're incentivized to target people based on the color of their skin. And they're incentivized to take that property from people without due process. And that happens over and over and over again, and it's perpetuating cycles of poverty, and it's flat out racist, and it's, I think, probably, barring the literal transcripts of legislators who said, we need to prohibit these drugs because black people use them. Those are actual transcripts from all of their meetings. Barring those, the second most blatantly racist thing that I can see in our drug policy is asset forfeiture.
Well, you mentioned, and I think we have only about 2 minutes,
Sure.
but I think it is pretty explicit that the drugs that are favored and the drugs that are not favored is related to who's using them or
Absolutely.
who's perceived as using them more than the actual, scientific effects of each drug.
Sure.
Well, in the last few minutes we have, can you tell people how they can find out more about SSDP or get involved in some way? Sure.
So, we're everywhere. The internet's great. SSDP.org is for the international organization. You can find out broad information there. If you're looking for UConn SSDP, the best place to get us is at facebook.com/UConn SSDP. We also have a weekly radio show I mentioned through UConn's radio station. That's 91.7 FM.
That's WHUS, which I think some people
I hope they listen to, and you can hear me there doing music too. So our show is Thursdays, 10:30 to 11 a.m. every week. It also streams online at WHUS.org, and you can hear me do music on Wednesdays from 1 to 3. Not tomorrow. I'll be in the State House. Facebook.com/UConn SSDP. WHUS is a great place, and I think those are the best places to get at us. If you'd like to contact us directly, the email address is UConn@chapters.ssdp.org.
Now, how will people know if this bill moves forward and there's a public hearing if they want to give testimony?
Right, so people should definitely contact their legislators and tell them they're in favor of it. That's really going to help. Specifically, Senator Eric Coleman, he's the chair of the Judiciary Committee. He can schedule the public hearing. So reach out to your legislators. They'll keep you updated to the best of their abilities. And on the Connecticut General Assembly website, there is bill tracking software. So people can type in the bill they're interested in, which is 6703 and 6473. They're both House bills. You can type in those numbers. Again, it's 6703 and 6473. You can add it to your tracker. They'll send you email updates when something happens. But I'd really encourage people to make sure the Judiciary Committee of the Connecticut General Assembly moves these bills to a public hearing, moves them to a vote. It might be difficult to see it actually get to the General Assembly floor, but I've heard some inklings that it might not be as hard as I think it is.
And it could not quite make it this year, but next year is
We've
a
opened up
longer
the
session.
conversation, and Massachusetts has a ballot initiative coming up in 2016. Rhode Island has had a bill for 3 consecutive years now, and they're getting close. Our neighbors are doing it. You know, 5.
And traditionally, Connecticut often does follow its neighbors.
We usually follow our neighbors.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Tyler.
Thank you.
Next week, we won't be live. Kathy Hermes, we pre-taped a show on the Healthy Workplace Bill. And in 2 weeks, we're going to have another show on drug policy. Patrick Hines, who is a retired corrections officer from Massachusetts, will be on the show giving his perspective and LEAP's perspective on the drug war. So thank you again,
Thank
and
you.
good luck at the State House tomorrow.
Yeah.